There are moments in history where silence is not peace, and deadlines are not just markers in time, they are warnings. In the heart of the Middle East, a nation older than most empires now watches the clock. Iran, a land steeped in history, philosophy, and revolution, has issued a deadline, not to the world, not to a neighbor, but to the United States of America. This is not the first time these two nations have stood on opposite ends of a line drawn in sand. From the oil fields of the 20th century to the embassies, the covert wars, the sanctions, the missiles, the road to this point has been long, winding, and filled with missed chances. Iran's message is clear: comply, withdraw, or face consequence. But make no mistake, this is not just about oil. It's not just about nuclear programs. It's about sovereignty. It's about regional power. It's about being heard. And for America, the question now looms large. Is diplomacy exhausted or simply ignored? Let us understand what a direct war would truly mean. It would not be swift. It would not be clean. It would stretch far beyond Tehran and Washington. Iraq, Syria, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, all would feel the tremors. Markets would crash, alliances would shift, and ordinary citizens, families, students, children, would pay the highest price. History does not always repeat itself, but it often rhymes. We have heard this rhythm before. In Vietnam, in Iraq, in Afghanistan. Deadlines like this are moments when world leaders must choose between wisdom and ego. We stand at a precipice, not because of fate, but because of choices made, words spoken, and power tested. And now the clock ticks. Not for war, not for peace, but for the human capacity to learn from the past, and the courage to change the course of what may soon become the next great global tragedy. Because war, once declared, is no longer a strategy. It is a consequence. To understand the gravity of Iran's deadline to the United States and the looming threat of direct war, one must first understand the long, tangled history that underpins this volatile relationship. These two nations, one a superpower born in revolution, the other a civilization thousands of years old, have danced a dangerous diplomatic waltz for over 70 years, often out of step and rarely in harmony. The story begins in many ways in 1953. That year, a democratically elected prime minister in Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh, moved to nationalize the Iranian oil industry, challenging British and Western economic dominance. In response, a covert operation orchestrated by American and British intelligence removed Mossadegh and restored the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, to absolute power. What followed was decades of authoritarian rule, modernizing reforms, and deep resentment simmering beneath a facade of Western-friendly governance. This early intervention would cast a long shadow. Many Iranians saw it as the West prioritizing oil profits over their right to self-determination. The bitterness only deepened as the Shah's regime became more repressive, bolstered by American support. In 1979, the volcano of public anger erupted. The Islamic Revolution swept across Iran, toppling the monarchy and ushering in a theocratic republic led by Ayatollah Khomeini. To the new regime, the United States was no longer just a foreign power. It was the Great Satan, a symbol of moral corruption and imperial arrogance. In November 1979, Iranian students stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, taking 52 American diplomats and citizens hostage for 444 days. It was a seismic shift in international relations. Overnight, Iran went from a U.S. ally to its most vocal adversary in the region. Sanctions followed, diplomatic relations were severed, and the ideological divide deepened. The next 4 decades would see a cycle of tensions, sanctions, proxy conflicts, and brief moments of diplomatic outreach. In the 1980s, during the brutal Iran-Iraq War, the United States quietly supported Saddam Hussein's Iraq, further entrenching Tehran's distrust. By the 1990s, the U.S. labeled Iran a member of the so-called Axis of Evil. These weren't just words. They were signals. Messages that Iran would be isolated unless it reformed, complied, and conformed to international standards set largely by Western powers. Yet, Iran had ambitions of its own. As a proud civilization with regional influence, it sought to define its path independently. Nuclear technology became a point of both national pride and global controversy. Tehran insisted on its right to peaceful nuclear energy. Washington and its allies feared weapons-grade enrichment. Years of negotiations culminated in the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, a landmark agreement that temporarily eased tension. Iran agreed to limit its nuclear program. In return, the West lifted key sanctions. But the accord was fragile. In 2018, the United States unilaterally withdrew from the deal under a new administration, reimposing severe sanctions under a policy of maximum pressure. Iran responded in kind, gradually ramping up uranium enrichment, tightening its grip on regional militias, and becoming more confrontational in its maritime activity. Each move by either side was both a statement and a strategy. By the early 2020s, the relationship teetered on the edge of open conflict. The assassination of General Qasem Soleimani, Iran's most powerful military commander, in a U.S. drone strike in Baghdad, further fueled hostilities. Iran retaliated with missile strikes on U.S. bases in Iraq. Cyber attacks increased. Proxy wars in Yemen, Syria, and Lebanon burned hotter. Each action brought the world closer to the edge of a confrontation few desired, but both sides prepared for. This context is crucial when analyzing Iran's recent deadline. It is not an isolated demand. It is the culmination of generations of mistrust, grievance, and strategic posturing. To Iran, the deadline represents a line in the sand, a declaration that its patience has limits, that sovereignty must be respected, and that it will no longer negotiate under economic duress. For the United States, the challenge is equally profound. It must decide whether to re-engage diplomatically, to increase pressure, or to prepare for the unthinkable. Direct conflict with a nation of 85 million, deeply entrenched in a network of regional alliances and asymmetric capabilities. The current crisis, therefore, is not just about military readiness or nuclear thresholds. It is a test of political memory. It asks whether either side has learned from the past, whether dialogue is still possible after decades of hostility, and whether restraint can still be chosen over retaliation. The world watches not just with concern, but with familiarity. For history has shown how such moments, left unchecked, can spiral into wars that neither side intended, but both were pulled into by pride, fear, and miscalculation. In this context, Iran's deadline is not simply a provocation. It is a historical echo, a reminder that unresolved conflict is never truly buried. It waits, patient and persistent, until the next spark. A deadline in international relations is rarely just a date on a calendar. It is a signal, a lever, and a calculated move intended to provoke a response or force a shift in dynamics. When Iran gives the United States a deadline, it is not issuing a mere ultimatum. It is executing a geopolitical maneuver, carefully crafted to project strength, test resolve, and recalibrate the balance of power. To fully understand the weight of Iran's deadline, one must look beyond the surface-level demand. Whether the deadline concerns the lifting of sanctions, a return to the nuclear deal, or the withdrawal of foreign troops from the region, the core of the message remains the same. Iran is asserting its agency in a world order where it has long felt marginalized and encircled. This is a country well versed in symbolic communication. It understands the power of optics, of timing, and of narrative. The issuing of a deadline, particularly in a moment of rising regional instability, is not a spontaneous gesture. It is time to intersect with political vulnerabilities in the West, whether during an election cycle in the United States, a power vacuum in Iraq, or growing anti-American sentiment in the Middle East. Iran chooses its moments with precision. The strategic calculus is rooted in asymmetric power dynamics. Militarily, Iran cannot match the conventional strength of the United States. But diplomatically and psychologically, deadlines serve as an equalizer. They introduce urgency. They unsettle markets. They create headlines. And they place the burden of response on the other side. By setting a deadline, Iran does several things at once. First, it shifts the narrative from that of a defiant pariah state to one of a sovereign actor establishing terms. Second, it tests international alignment. How will Europe respond? What about China or Russia? Deadlines force third parties to weigh in, revealing fractures or alliances that might otherwise remain dormant. Third, it creates a window, a psychological countdown, in which diplomatic choices must be made before military or economic consequences are implied. For Iran, this tactic is deeply rooted in its strategic doctrine. The country's foreign policy has long combined hard power through military capabilities and proxy forces with soft power through cultural diplomacy, legal arguments, and well-timed public statements. The deadline, in this case, acts as a form of political theater with real-world implications. It announces, "We will not wait forever," but it also dares the other side to either escalate or compromise. From the American perspective, such a move is often seen as provocative, an attempt to pressure Washington into concessions without the formalities of negotiation. However, it is also an opportunity. Deadlines, if handled wisely, can serve as moments to reset or re-engage. In the world of diplomacy, a well-timed deadline can bring clarity to otherwise stalled or ambiguous talks, but mishandled, it can lead to miscalculation, or worse, misinterpretation. One must also consider the domestic audience. Iranian leaders do not speak solely to the West when they issue deadlines. They speak to their own people, to factions within the government, to the powerful Revolutionary Guard, and to a public weary of economic hardship. The act of drawing a line reinforces the image of resistance and strength, key pillars of the Islamic Republic's internal legitimacy. The leadership must demonstrate that they are not capitulating to Western demands, especially after years of sanctions and perceived betrayal. following the collapse of the nuclear agreement. In this sense, the deadline is both an international message and a domestic tool. It communicates resolve externally and unifies politically internally. What complicates the matter further is the ambiguity that often surrounds these deadlines. They are rarely clear-cut. Iran may say that unless certain demands are met by a given date, it will act, but what form that action will take? Increased uranium enrichment, military retaliations, cyber operations, or disruption of shipping lanes is often left deliberately vague. This ambiguity itself is a form of leverage. It keeps adversaries guessing. It buys time while appearing firm. It raises the costs of inaction without committing fully to escalation. In the broader context of Middle Eastern geopolitics, such a move also serves as a message to allies and rivals alike. To Israel, it signals readiness. To Gulf states like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, it warns of potential regional fallout. To proxies in Lebanon, Iraq, and Yemen, it is a cue to prepare. Iran's networked influence means that any decision at the top can echo through a constellation of non-state actors, a reality that makes the consequences of ignoring the deadline potentially widespread. What makes this all the more dangerous is the tendency for deadlines to narrow options. Once issued, they demand a response, and once the response comes, especially if it is dismissive or defiant, the side that issued the deadline must either escalate or risk appearing weak. This is the trap of rigidity. The deadline that was meant to force diplomacy can, if not managed carefully, become the very thing that forces war. And so we return to the essential truth. In global politics, a deadline is not just a marker in time. It is a bet, a calculated wager that the other side will blink first. Whether Iran's deadline leads to renewed diplomacy or spirals into direct confrontation depends not only on military strength or strategic depth, but on something far more elusive: the wisdom of restraint, the courage to dialogue, and the ability of leaders to see beyond the short-term optics of dominance toward the long-term consequences of escalation. The clock, now ticking, is not just a countdown. It is a test of patience, of principle, and of the power of diplomacy over destruction. The prospect of a direct war between Iran and the United States is not merely a theoretical concern. It is a geopolitical nightmare with wide-reaching consequences. While tensions have been simmering for decades through economic sanctions, cyber warfare, political isolation, and proxy conflicts, a direct military confrontation would mark a dangerous evolution, one that would set fire not only to the Middle East, but potentially ignite global instability on an unprecedented scale in the modern era. To grasp the implications of such a war, it's essential to begin by understanding the nature of the conflict. This would not be a traditional battlefield engagement between two evenly matched nations. Instead, it would be a complex hybrid war, blending advanced missile strikes, cyber attacks, ascendant movements, maritime disruption, and possibly nuclear brinkmanship. Iran cannot match the United States in terms of raw military firepower, air superiority, or technological advantage. But war is not won solely on those terms. Iran's defense strategy is built on endurance, decentralization, and denial. It does not aim to win outright. It aims to exhaust, destabilize, and retaliate in ways that are deeply embedded across geography and ideology. The first implication would be regional escalation. Iran possesses significant influence across the Middle East through its alliances with non-state actors and militias such as Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, and various Shia militias in Iraq and Syria. If war begins, these groups will not sit idle. Israel, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and other American allies could find themselves under fire, drawing them directly into the conflict. The Gulf, already volatile, could turn into a fully militarized zone with civilian populations caught in the crossfire. The Strait of Hormuz, through which nearly 20% of the world's oil passes, would almost certainly become a battlefield. A disruption there, even for a few weeks, would send global oil prices soaring, trigger supply chain chaos, and destabilize already fragile economies in both developed and developing countries. Second, the human cost would be catastrophic. Any war with Iran would likely include high-intensity airstrikes, naval engagements, and missile exchanges. Iranian cities, military installations, and strategic infrastructure would become targets. In retaliation, Iran could strike U.S. military bases in Iraq, Syria, Bahrain, and Qatar. Civilian casualties would be unavoidable, and the refugee crisis already severe due to conflicts in Syria and Yemen, would expand. The people who would suffer most are not generals or politicians, but ordinary men, women, and children, many of whom have already endured years of hardship and instability. Third, cyber warfare would become a central front. Iran has developed a sophisticated cyber program capable of attacking critical infrastructure. In the past, it has targeted financial systems, water utilities, and even oil pipelines. A full-scale war would likely unleash massive cyber attacks on American infrastructure, power grids, communication systems, and financial networks. Retaliation would follow in kind. Unlike conventional warfare, cyber conflict knows no borders and no front lines. Its effects can ripple across continents in milliseconds, making it one of the most unpredictable and dangerous aspects of any future confrontation. There is also the question of nuclear escalation. While Iran does not currently possess a nuclear weapon, its ability to enrich uranium has advanced rapidly in recent years, particularly following the U.S. withdrawal from the 2015 nuclear agreement. Should war break out, Iran might abandon all international safeguards, pushing aggressively toward weaponization. The international community, especially Israel, which has long viewed a nuclear-armed Iran as an existential threat, would almost certainly act, possibly preemptively. This raises the specter of a broader nuclear crisis, dragging in other powers like Russia and China, both of which have their own strategic interests in the region. In the United States, a war with Iran would mark the beginning of yet another costly and potentially unending military engagement. After the lessons of Iraq and Afghanistan, where trillions of dollars were spent, thousands of lives lost, and regional stability shattered, the American public is likely to be deeply skeptical of another Middle Eastern intervention. The economic costs would be vast. Increased defense spending, global market volatility, higher fuel prices, and long-term strain on military readiness. Politically, such a war could further polarize domestic politics and disrupt U.S. alliances in Europe and Asia, especially if the conflict is perceived as avoidable or unprovoked. Iran, meanwhile, would face existential consequences. The regime's survival would be on the line. In response, it could adopt a total war approach, mobilizing every tool at its disposal. including unconventional warfare. It might rely more heavily on religious rhetoric, casting the war as a civilizational struggle between Islam and Western imperialism. This narrative, whether accurate or not, could galvanize resistance across the Islamic world and radicalize new generations. Terrorism could rise. Global security would deteriorate. Perhaps the most profound implication is that such a war would set a precedent, that diplomacy, even after years of negotiation and compromise, can be discarded. It would signal to smaller nations that power, not principle, determines survival. It would erode the already fragile trust in international institutions meant to resolve disputes peacefully, and it would widen the gulf between East and West, between ideologies, between civilizations, and between peoples who, at their core, all seek the same things: security, dignity, and peace. Throughout history, moments of rising tension between nations have often hinged on a single choice: the decision to escalate or to resolve. The path that follows that choice determines more than policy. It shapes the future of nations and the memory of generations. As Iran gives the United States a deadline and the world edges toward the possibility of a direct war, the situation demands not just a political response, but a deeper reckoning with the past. The story unfolding now is not without precedent, and therein lies both a warning and an opportunity. Time and again, history has shown us the danger of misreading intent, of letting pride eclipse prudence. The events leading to World War I are a classic example. A single assassination in Sarajevo lit the match, but it was the web of rigid alliances, unchecked militarism, and national egos that turned it into a global catastrophe. Leaders believed the conflict would be short, decisive, and honorable. Instead, it was long, brutal, and devastating. By the time diplomacy was considered again, tens of millions were dead, and Europe was forever changed. In more recent memory, the 2003 invasion of Iraq offers a sobering lesson in the perils of acting on assumptions. The belief that weapons of mass destruction were hidden beneath the sands of Mesopotamia fueled a war that destabilized an entire region. The government that fell was replaced not by peace, but by power vacuums, insurgency, and sectarian strife. It was not a failure of strength. It was a failure of foresight. The price was measured in lives, dollars, trust, and time that can never be regained. This is the context in which the current standoff with Iran must be understood. Deadlines can clarify, but they can also corner. They can focus attention, but they can also harden positions. Iran's use of a deadline is meant to signal that diplomacy has limits, that pressure without reciprocity will not be tolerated indefinitely. Yet, from a historical lens, deadlines have often marked the end of negotiation, not its beginning. There are moments when rhetoric begins to drown out reason. Hubris, the overconfidence of one's position, the dismissal of alternative perspectives, has played a decisive role in nearly every major conflict. It is a quiet force, often masked as resolve or patriotism. Leaders believe they understand the enemy. They believe they control the pace of escalation. They believe they can end what they start. But wars are not machines. They are fires. Once ignited, they follow no master. Diplomacy, on the other hand, is rarely dramatic. It is slow, incremental, and often frustrating. But it is also one of the highest expressions of human intelligence, the ability to listen, to bargain, to see value in compromise even when strength could be exercised. The most successful diplomatic outcomes are not those where one side walks away triumphant, but those where both sides feel they have avoided something worse. Consider the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. Two nuclear powers, the United States and the Soviet Union, stood on the brink of annihilation. The pressure to act militarily was immense. Yet it was restraint, back-channel communication, and ultimately mutual compromise that averted disaster. No war was fought, and yet the lessons were enduring. Sometimes stepping back requires more courage than stepping forward. In the current moment, both Iran and the United States stand to lose far more than they can gain from direct confrontation. Iran, for all its resilience, faces severe economic pressures, internal political challenges, and a population increasingly weary of isolation. The United States, despite its military dominance, must navigate a shifting global order, strained alliances, and a public skeptical of another costly entanglement. The wiser path forward is not through dominance, but through understanding. What complicates this further is the role of perception. In international affairs, perception often becomes reality. If a nation appears weak, it may invite aggression. If it appears too aggressive, it may provoke resistance. This balance is delicate, and when deadlines are involved, the time to consider nuance is compressed. Leaders must act not only with strategic clarity, but with moral responsibility. The consequences of failing to manage this moment are not abstract. They are measured in shattered cities, orphaned children, fractured economies, and a planet further destabilized. These are not theoretical outcomes. They are the lived experiences of people in Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, Libya, and beyond. The lesson is clear. Wars may begin with intentions, but they end in consequences. And once those consequences unfold, they are often irreversible. There remains, however, a narrow window, a space where dialogue can replace defiance, where empathy can temper escalation. This window requires humility. It requires both nations to see beyond the headlines and beyond the rhetoric. It requires the courage to see the other not only as a rival, but as a reflection, a nation driven by fear, by pride, by history, and by a desire for survival. In the end, the decision facing the United States and Iran is not just about geopolitical leverage or strategic dominance. It is about whether the lessons of the past will be remembered or repeated. It is about whether diplomacy will be given one more chance, even when the path to war seems inevitable. Hell, because inevitability is not destiny. It is a choice made in silence, behind closed doors, by those who hold the power to speak peace or summon destruction. Let us hope they choose wisely.